No ar.
Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas, sejam muito bem-vindos ao 11º Seminário de Proteção à Privacidade e aos Dados Pessoais, uma iniciativa do Comitê Gestor da Internet no Brasil e do Núcleo de Informação e Coordenação do .br, o NIC.br, neste que é um dos mais importantes eventos sobre esse tema do nosso país. Nesse ano, em função da pandemia da Covid-19, o seminário está acontecendo pela primeira vez em formato totalmente online, e até a próxima sexta-feira vão ser diversas conferências e painéis com composição multissetorial, como é característica do nosso comitê gestor, relacionando a proteção e a privacidade aos dados pessoais, com temas como a vigência da LGPD, a recém-criada, instituída formalmente agora Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados, a questão das eleições, a própria pandemia, segurança pública, Open Bank e outros temas. Meu nome é Bia Barbosa, eu sou jornalista, faço parte de uma organização da sociedade civil que se chama Intervozes, e também da coalizão Direitos na Rede, que reúne cerca de 40 organizações que trabalham com a defesa de direitos digitais no Brasil, e fui eleita recentemente para ser uma das conselheiras representantes do terceiro setor no Comitê Gestor da Internet. Com muita honra, eu vou moderar a nossa segunda conferência, do nosso segundo dia de seminário, que vai ser feita pela Claire Wardle, e vai tratar do poder e do impacto do ecossistema da desinformação na privacidade. A disseminação de boatos e de informações falsas é um fenômeno tão antigo quanto a história das próprias comunicações. No entanto, o avanço e o desenvolvimento da internet permitiram o crescimento da propagação das desinformações uma velocidade no alcance sem precedentes, trazendo sérias consequências nos mais diversos campos da sociedade. Não apenas em processos eleitorais, como o que o Brasil acabou de atravessar, mas também em contextos e em momentos estratégicos para o país, como durante o enfrentamento, a própria questão da pandemia da Covid-19, em momentos decisivos de votação no Congresso Nacional, para o desenvolvimento de políticas públicas. As campanhas e as práticas de desinformação têm um impacto significativo na vida dos cidadãos e das cidadãs. E a relação entre campanhas de desinformação e o uso de dados pessoais também não é uma questão nova. Desde o escândalo da Cambridge Analytica em 2018, não foi apenas o microdirecionamento de conteúdos e anúncios políticos que chamou a atenção do mundo, mas também o uso de dados pessoais sensíveis para se manipular e desinformar da maneira mais eficiente possível os usuários das redes sociais. No Brasil, parte importante da defesa que foi feita por diferentes setores para aprovação em 2018 e para a entrada em vigor agora em setembro da Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados Pessoais também se baseou nas expectativas de que a existência de regras democráticas para o tratamento de dados pessoais pudesse impactar positivamente no combate às chamadas fake news aqui no Brasil. Por outro lado, as discussões sobre o enfrentamento à desinformação também geraram, no âmbito do Parlamento brasileiro, um projeto de lei já aprovado no Senado Federal e que agora está tramitando na Câmara dos Deputados, que tem trazido muitas preocupações do ponto de vista da privacidade dos usuários das redes sociais e dos serviços de mensageria privada. Uma das propostas, por exemplo, que esse projeto, o PL 2630, traz é obrigar aplicativos como o WhatsApp a guardarem por 3 meses os metadados, remetente, destinatário, dia e hora do encaminhamento das mensagens enviadas em massa pela rede. E aí o projeto define mensagens em massa como aquelas que seriam enviadas por mais de 5 usuários num intervalo de 15 dias, que alcançassem 1.000 pessoas e que fossem enviadas via grupos de conversas ou listas de transmissão. Esses registros, esses metadados, se o projeto for aprovado, poderão ser acessados mediante ordem judicial para a constituição de prova em investigação criminal e também em instrução processual penal, com o objetivo de responsabilizar o encaminhamento em massa de eventuais conteúdos ilícitos. O argumento dos defensores da rastreabilidade nos aplicativos de mensageria privada é que esse mecanismo é necessário para conter a desinformação nos aplicativos de comunicação privada. Por outro lado, há uma preocupação muito grande de que essa guarda e esse monitoramento permanente de mensagens resultem numa vigilância massiva das comunicações pessoais, colocando em risco a privacidade dos usuários. Outra previsão do projeto de lei, que está sendo acompanhado por um grupo de trabalho do qual eu participo no comitê gestor da internet, é que as redes sociais tenham que comprovar a identificação dos usuários mediante a apresentação de documentos para combater as contas inautênticas nas plataformas, que poderiam ser utilizadas para a prática de disseminação de desinformação. Os especialistas em privacidade temem que essa medida forneça ainda mais dados pessoais para as grandes plataformas digitais, num contexto de já significativa concentração de dados por essas redes. Essas e outras propostas vão ser debatidas, inclusive, hoje em detalhe, a partir das 5h30, num painel que faz parte da programação do nosso seminário, que vai tratar especificamente das medidas em discussão no Legislativo brasileiro. Na conferência que começa agora, a gente vai discutir se essas estratégias são importantes e são efetivas ou não para combater a disseminação no ambiente online. E vamos discutir como fazer isso sem violar o direito constitucional à privacidade e o direito à proteção dos nossos dados pessoais. E considerando que a Claire Wardle é uma das mais renomadas especialistas em todo o mundo no tema da desinformação e no impacto da manipulação de plataformas que funcionam com base em conteúdos produzidos por terceiros, a gente agradece muito ela ter aceito o convite para vir discutir esses temas conosco hoje no 11º seminário. A Claire é cofundadora e diretora executiva da First Draft News, uma das mais importantes organizações em pesquisa e prática de enfrentamento à desinformação, ligada à Universidade de Harvard. A First Draft trabalha com a relação entre tecnologia, teoria da comunicação e mídias sociais de massa, buscando empoderar a sociedade civil por meio do conhecimento, da compreensão de ferramentas para superar as informações falsas e enganosas. A Claire também é uma das coautoras do relatório elaborado para o Conselho da Europa, que foi publicado em 2017, intitulado Desordem Informacional, rumo a um framework interdisciplinar para pesquisa e formulação de políticas públicas, que se tornou uma grande referência para o debate aqui no Brasil. E, anteriormente, ela foi pesquisadora fellow do Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics and Public Policy, e também diretora de pesquisa no Town Center for Digital Journalism, na Escola de Jornalismo de Colômbia. Trabalhou em redações e organizações da sociedade civil de diferentes países, com formação e consultoria sobre a transformação digital. A Claire é mestre em ciência política e doutora em comunicação pela Universidade da Pensilvânia. Também é importante mencionar que ela é uma das coordenadoras do projeto Comprova, realizado aqui no Brasil em parceria com 28 veículos e organizações, e que teve a 3ª edição agora acompanhando essa etapa, o primeiro turno das eleições municipais no Brasil, realizando ações de verificação de fato durante as eleições. Então, Claire, muitíssimo obrigada por ter aceito esse convite, por estar aqui novamente com a gente, e passo a palavra para você, para essa conferência. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Bia, and thank you very much for inviting me. Some of you might know that I have traveled to Sao Paulo 5 times when we were working on the Comprova project. It is one of my favorite cities. I have had some of the best meals of my life in Sao Paulo. So I am very sad that I am not with you in person. As ever, let's hope that this pandemic clears up and we can go back to meeting each other across borders and not just meeting each other on Zoom. So I have got some slides. I'm going to talk about a number of things that Bia just explained in an excellent way. There's lots of issues for us to discuss. And I was like, oh, I didn't say that in the presentation. So we will have time for questions afterwards for things that I have missed. But let's get going. I want to talk to you today about the power and impact of misinformation on the privacy ecosystem. And just to let everybody know, I am actually British. I was an academic. I taught at Cardiff University in Wales. And so in many ways, I have real sympathy with GDPR and the European sensibility for privacy. I now live in the US, and so I hear a lot of conversations in the US connected to the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And so it's a very interesting place to be a European living in the US. But I wanted to give you some context very quickly. I, as an academic, was asked by the BBC in 2008 to write a report about user-generated content, because the BBC all of a sudden was getting emails and text messages from the audience. There was this thing called Facebook that they didn't understand. There was this thing called Twitter they didn't understand. And so I wrote this report and thought I would go back to being an academic. But then just as I was finishing the report up, this happened, which you might remember from January 2009. So I just want to remind everybody how quickly this ecosystem has changed. This is just 11 years ago. This plane landed in the Hudson River and Janice Crumbs tweeted this picture, and the BBC said, "We didn't know how to find this picture. We didn't know how to verify this picture. And we didn't know whether we could use this picture legally or ethically. Can you leave academia and come and train us at the BBC?" And so that was 11 years ago. And I have yet to go back to academia, and I continue to work with the industry. But my very, very niche research topic, which was how do you verify what's true online, has now become the thing that everybody is obsessed with. So I feel incredibly fortunate to be able to run a nonprofit where we think about these challenges all the time, which is disinformation is damaging communities around the world. But how do we navigate this? And how do we ensure that we're not making quick, knee-jerk reactions to disinformation that could actually cause more harm to our communities in the long run? And that's why these conversations about privacy are so critical, because there is a panic at the moment about disinformation. And we do need to think very carefully about how we're responding to this moment in history, because it is a moment, and the decisions we make now, we're going to have to live with for a long time. So as Bia discussed, I wrote this report in 2017 with Hossein Darakhshan, and it's still very relevant. And in it, I really tried to emphasize how people have an emotional relationship to information. It's not rational. The ways that people decide what to share with each other has a ritual element to it. They are performing their identity. We can't just think about this as facts and data. We have to understand how information lives within somebody's day-to-day life. What are they doing with that information? And I also talk a lot about importance of visuals, which still many people don't take seriously. There's a disproportionate emphasis on text, when actually the problems we face are much more visual. And also this impact of the pivot to privacy, which I remember starting to talk about in 2017, and is now why we're having these conversations about WhatsApp. In the last 3 years, people recognized that they were being surveyed. There was a chilling effect on speech because of different regulation that was being passed around the world. And so people started moving into closed Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, SMS messenger spaces. There was a reason that they did that. And we have to understand why they did that. And that's why we have to have these conversations about why those spaces are important and necessary. And just to have a little shout out to Comprova, because it really is one of the projects that I'm most proud of in my work in this space. It's still going. Lots of these kind of election projects. We started this in 2018 for your election. They die after the election. And I'm so incredibly proud that Comprova continues in Brazil. The conversations I've had with Brazilian journalists have been some of the best in my life. So I just want to say thank you to Brazil for being willing to work together on this project. It's very rare that newsrooms will work together. They like to compete, but I'm still incredibly proud of this work and so pleased that it continues today. So in this presentation today, I'm going to start by giving an overview of key information disorder concepts. I am very famous for refusing to use the term fake news. Most of this content isn't fake. Most of this content isn't news. And most importantly, the term has been weaponized by politicians around the world to attack a free and independent press. So we cannot use that phrase because it has been turned into a weapon. I'm then going to talk about misinformation regulation around the world and what that looks like and what we need to think about. I'm then going to talk about why we need to think more innovatively about platform data. So one of my frustrations is that we've got caught in this deadlock with researchers saying, we need more platform data, and the platform saying, we can't give it to you, and researchers saying, but we need it. And we're just going round and round in circles. We really need to understand both the scale of misinformation globally and the impact. And right now, if I was giving evidence to a congressional inquiry and they asked me, I could not give an answer. And that's the biggest problem that we have. We should not be thinking about regulation in this space until we have a clear empirical foundation for understanding the complexities of this problem. And right now, we don't have that understanding, and we have to have that understanding. And so we need to think about different ways of doing research about platforms, about disinformation, and its impact on communities. I'm going to end with that plea, which is what we need to partner with users and communities. We need to stop thinking about this around, well, if only governments did this, if only platforms did that. We have to put users and communities at the center of these conversations and at the center of these research projects so that they can be partners in these conversations around what kind of information ecosystem do we want as societies. And that is unfortunately what is missing from these conversations. So firstly, the overview of key information disorder concepts. And I have learned from the amazing translators that in Portuguese, there isn't different terms for this. So I'm going to explain it and hopefully it will make sense to you, even if there isn't a particular Portuguese word. But first of all, I'm going to start with disinformation. And this is false information when people create and share it, knowing that it's false or misleading, deliberately trying to cause harm. Now, that is different to misinformation, which is when people share false and misleading information, but they don't know it's false and they don't mean to cause harm. So that's if my mum shares something on Facebook, she doesn't know that it's false and she doesn't mean any harm. Now, we should treat my mum's behavior in a very different way than we should treat a Russian troll trying to meddle in the US election. That's two very different things, and we need to treat them as such. The third category we described as malinformation, and that's because increasingly we're seeing genuine information being weaponized. We're seeing people leaking email, for example, leaking emails that should not be leaked. Sometimes they should be, and whistleblowers exist for a reason. But things like revenge porn is an example of genuine content that gets used against somebody to cause harm. So the purpose of this Venn diagram was to try and get people to understand the different elements of this, because fundamentally, if we're going to start talking about regulation, we have to agree on definitions. And I would argue that we still don't have good definitions for a lot of this content. And I'm even going to suggest that some of these definitions are no longer as useful as they once were because the way that the information ecosystem is shifting and changing. But I'll talk more to that later in the lecture. And there are four motivations for why people create disinformation or share misinformation. So financial, there are still a lot of people creating false and misleading content to drive clicks and to make money, who are creating hoaxes, trying to sell false goods to people. That is one bucket of motivation. The second is political. There are people who are trying to influence domestic or foreign elections or reputations. That's political. That is distinct from social motivations. We have to understand that there is a huge social component for the types of information that people share. So if we think about conspiracy theories, it's impossible to say, is that conspiracy theory disinformation or misinformation? Do people who believe the earth is flat, do they mean harm? Do they know that it's false? They are doing it because they are part of a community that gives them a sense of belonging. Now, we have to consider that motivation in a very different way that we would financial or political. And the last one is kind of this psychological, which is some people just want to see if they can get away with it. They're just in it for a laugh. I mean, it's hard to understand these people, but they exist. These domestic trolls, they exist for a reason. They're trying to cause harm just to see if they can get away with it. They don't believe that institutions help them, and they're trying to undermine institutions. So we need to understand all of these different motivations if we're going to start thinking about regulation. And these are the 7 types of mis and disinformation that I created back in 2017 to get people to stop using very simplistic terms. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. The first one being satire or parody, which some people say, oh, that shouldn't be on your spectrum, Claire. But we see bad actors creating content and labeling it as satire deliberately so that fact checkers won't mark it down on Facebook. But the problem is, I wouldn't be able to tell you Brazil's leading satirical site, but on Facebook, everything looks the same. So unfortunately, satire is a tactic that we see people using. Secondly, false connection, things like misleading headlines, clickbait headlines. Even this is a fact check, but headlines that actually reinforce a rumor, we need to be aware of what that is and how it fits into the ecosystem. I would argue that it is an example of information disorder. Misleading content, diagrams, graphs, statistics. This has always been a problem, and we just see more of it now. This is a graph talking about the number of positive tests for COVID-19. It means nothing if we don't know the number of tests that are being deployed in the first place. So unfortunately, we are still really bad as journalists at talking about science and research. False context. This was circulating widely earlier in the pandemic. It is a genuine visualization, but it's suggesting that this is how coronavirus has spread around the world. It's actually a flight network map from 2011. So it's a genuine piece of content, but the context has been weaponized. This is the biggest bucket of content we see. And the reason I'm going into this detail with you is because how does the legislation, the types of legislation that we're talking about now, how does it deal with this type of content? Is this disinformation or is it misinformation? It starts as disinformation, it becomes misinformation. How do we use artificial intelligence to make sense of this? Would a computer be able to tell you that this is a genuine image, but it's the context that doesn't match? There's all sorts of challenges that we face, and it's only by looking at the types of examples that we see every day that you realize how complex this landscape is, and that simplistic responses by regulators are really problematic in their own right. So things like imposter content, when people use logos of known news organizations or health organizations, our brains are desperate for heuristics, mental shortcuts that help us make sense of information. Again, we see a lot of imposter content. Manipulated content. An 8-year-old with a Mac computer could have photoshopped this mask on, which is, as we can see, xenophobic, low-level, hateful content. We see so much of this type of content out here. It's a very easy thing to create. It gets shared very, very widely. Again, it's a visual that a computer would really struggle to make sense of. So how do we do content moderation at scale? And finally, fabricated content. These are 100% rumors, completely made up. We see far fewer of these. We see a lot more of that false context. I'm not worried about deep fakes yet. I don't see bad actors spending the money necessary to create these fabrications when they can have the same impact using or creating these cheap or shallow fakes. So this is just what I want to stress, that I obviously spend all day in the worst parts of the internet, and only by doing the work that I do I understand that none of our current definitions work on a practical level. We see people talking about problematic content. Mark Zuckerberg talks about problematic content. We hear people talking about harmful content, coordinated inauthentic behavior, online harms. But what do we mean by those terms? What does that mean in practice? What would we do with all of those examples that I just gave you? I could have given you thousands of those examples from my work over the last 10 years. What would we do with each of them practically? And I think that's what we're missing from this conversation, is that people say, well, it's just the fake content, it's just the problematic content. What I would say as somebody who does this work is that it's very rare for me to see really horrific false content. Most of what I see goes right up to policy guidelines, but doesn't cross them. As the platforms have taken greater steps towards cracking down on this content, they have more fact checkers, they're doing more labeling, they're demoting more content. In that world, bad actors have realized, well, I need to change my strategy. So instead, what we see is a drip, 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 a constant drumbeat of low-level, divisive, harassing, hateful content, but not enough for any one of those pieces to be taken down or to be labeled. And that's the problem that we need to have the conversation around. And so that's to my point, is that even mis and disinformation makes little sense, as intent is so difficult to measure. As I said, with those conspiracy theories, these people who are anti-vax, they truly believe that vaccines are not safe. They truly believe they should have the right to not vaccinate their children. Now, in their heads, it's not false or misleading content, and they don't think they're causing harm. So how do we add that kind of social and community understanding into our Venn diagram? And as I just said, what we need to recognize is the long-term impact of these atoms of content, the individual post. As I said, most of these wouldn't break any platform policy guidelines. But what they do is these atoms of content fit within these overarching narratives that are shaping the way people think about issues, institutions, and individuals. And that is what we need to really consider. And my worry about conversations that I hear regulators have is that they're still very much focused on individual atoms of content that need to be taken down or labeled. Yes, yes, yes. But what does it mean if we zoom out and we understand what this content is doing over a long-term cumulative effect? What does it mean over 10 years? What is this kind of content doing to our societies? And we just do not have this type of longitudinal research. And without that, again, we shouldn't be thinking about regulation unless we have those empirical findings. And so as an example, we just launched this research last week at First Draft. It's about COVID-19 vaccine narratives. And we really wanted to zoom out and understand how this was playing out online. And so we took 1,200 different examples in English, Spanish, and French, and we hand coded them. We basically put them into different buckets to understand the different narratives. And as you can see here, we coded them around political and economic motives. So unfortunately, the biggest narrative here is how pharmaceutical companies, governments, Bill Gates, WHO are making money from vaccines. That's the way that this is being framed online. It's about undermining those people who we need to trust in order to take the vaccine. Right down at the bottom, this was particularly the case in Spanish language narratives, but morality and religion was really critical. In English language, it was liberty and freedom. People saying, I don't want to get vaccinated. People are going to come and microchip me. This is about government surveillance. I refuse to be vaccinated because I want my body to be free. So how do we understand these narratives as opposed to just zooming in on individual posts? But this kind of research is time consuming, it's laborious. We tried to use machine learning to do this. It was impossible. Machines are not quick enough or clever enough to do this kind of analysis. And so we need this research, but it's not easy to do. And so finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about understanding the full ecosystem, because this is critical to this question about privacy. In that a lot of the work that we do is that we see these kind of campaigns starting on the anonymous web. It might be 4chan, it might be Discord. There's spaces that it's impossible to know who's starting these campaigns, but they're very small in number. And these people don't have a large audience. The only way they can be successful is to ultimately to try and get the professional media or politicians or influencers to talk about them. That's their end goal. And so what you'll see is that it moves through the ecosystem. So from the anonymous web, they might go to closed WhatsApp groups or to closed Facebook groups or to Twitter direct messaging groups. And in those spaces, they will talk about, well, we should use this hashtag at this time. We should be pushing out this meme, which I love in Brazilian is meme. Portuguese, that's my favorite word. So they are coordinating in these closed networks. Then they move into conspiracy communities. That might be on Gab, or it might be on Parler, which is the new platform we're now talking about. It might be in conspiracy communities on YouTube. Then the idea is it gets picked up by people on social media. So then it's on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And unfortunately, that is often where journalists or politicians or influencers, they find this content and then they amplify it. Sometimes they just amplify the rumor as is. They don't realize it's false. Sometimes the media understands that it's false and they will report on it. The problem is if they report on it, in an irresponsible way, it gives that rumor oxygen and legitimacy. And so that's the challenge today. And the reason I put this all together is, if from a regulatory perspective, we're just focusing on one platform, we're missing the ways that this information moves through the ecosystem. The platforms themselves are doing a little bit more of talking to one another, but ultimately YouTube is monitoring YouTube, Twitter is monitoring Twitter, Facebook is monitoring Facebook. But the problem is this content moves across those different platforms. So we need, if we're going to think about regulation or we're going to think about responses, we need to understand how the information ecosystem works. And my frustration is not enough people understand it because they're not doing this work all the time. And because this comes down to the tipping point. If I go looking for misinformation online, I will always find it. I could go right now onto Facebook and I could find all sorts of conspiracy theories, all sorts of anti-vax content, pretty nasty stuff. Now, if I'm a reporter or I'm Facebook, what am I going to do with that? And so the challenge is understanding when it is that a rumor has traveled so quickly that actually we need to take action to try and damp that down. Again, we need more research about this. What kind of posts are more likely to go viral? What kind of content is more likely to be shared on Facebook? What kind of content is more likely to be shared on Instagram? There's all these sorts of questions that people need to ask, and we still know so little about these kind of questions. We don't have good answers for them. We need more research before we can start thinking about responses. So this will not surprise you that my position on this is that we should focus on curtailing freedom of reach, not freedom of speech. And the one good thing we've seen in 2020 is the platforms have started innovating around different responses that isn't just, let's take it down. They are thinking about things like shadow banning. They are thinking about things like context labels. They are thinking about down ranking, taking things out of recommendation algorithms. That they are all good initiatives. But again, and I know I sound like a scratched record, my slight frustration about 2020 is that there has been no independent oversight on the platforms who have taken these interventions. So it's very easy to applaud them and say, well done, Twitter, for labeling all of Donald Trump's tweets. But what we don't know is, what are the unintended consequences of labeling tweets? Is that actually driving down trust in certain communities? Is it actually leading more people to search for that content elsewhere? We have to have independent oversight, because ultimately, as a researcher, to be fair, on election day, Twitter were moving very, very quickly, and they were taking content down sometimes within 5 minutes. And so as a researcher, I was like, hang on, I haven't had a chance to archive that. So I couldn't even tell you about all of the different types of disinformation that circulated on election day in the US, because I don't have a full archive, because people at Twitter were making decisions and there is no archive for us to look at. There's no transparency. I don't know why they made certain decisions. So yes, we are moving in better directions, but we have to have oversight, and we can't just applaud interventions if we don't recognize that there might be unintended consequences. So let's just very quickly talk about misinformation regulation around the world. I don't think this map has been updated recently, but this is Pointer created this attempt to understand all the different regulation that was happening around the world. If anybody knows of a better one that's up to date, I would love to hear about it. I was part of the EU Commission's high-level expert group on fake news and online disinformation back in March of 2018. And what it made me recognize was how little we know about this space. I mean, I knew that we didn't know much, but I was very concerned about the kind of conversations I heard around that table that was not based on anything other than kind of like a gut instinct about what would be a good thing. I didn't hear enough conversations about micro-targeting. I didn't hear enough conversations about the way that data was being used and weaponized to push disinformation. I heard a disproportionate reliance on fact-checking after disinformation had circulated. I did not see enough conversations about coordinated campaigns, the ways in which the whole ecosystem was being weaponized. And I think it really opened my eyes to the speed at which people wanted to take action, but the complete absence of an empirical foundation for those conversations. And that for me really worried me about where we are today. And I think we all know this, but Germany moved very quickly in 2017 with a response to misinformation. But now we see them revisiting that because they see that it was problematic. It certainly had a chilling effect on speech because the fines were so high that platforms were taking down far too much speech just in case. And that for me was the biggest wake-up call around we need to be very careful. And particularly countries like Germany have to be very careful because here you see Turkey emulating what Germany did. And that's what we need to worry about, which is other countries saying, well, Germany did it, so we can do it too. I think we moved way too quickly in a response to kind of 2016 and the Philippine election, the Brexit results and the US election. And we saw this knee-jerk reaction. And we still don't know enough, I don't think, to have regulation like this. Similarly, Singapore introduced, I would argue, problematic legislation almost this time last year. And now they've recognized that coronavirus has really put them to the test because the government is asking the platforms to take down content that is suggesting that the Singapore government hasn't done a good job. That is hugely problematic. And again, I think another test case of how badly this can go if we don't think through these questions around definitions and enforcement. And of course, I'm not going to talk to you about your law because there are many, many people, I'm sure, as part of this conference who will talk about this law. But I was pretty shocked when I went to do research about what is obviously going through your different legislative houses right now. And I think it goes back to this question of what's practical. And so I pulled this out from a piece by the Center for Democracy and Technology. From a practical standpoint, companies cannot know which of the messages originated or forwarded on their platform will meet the traceability requirements later. Therefore, all messages, and not just broadcasters' messages, would have to be traceable because of the possibility that any message could go viral. So I go back to, we know so little about what potentially could go viral. There's so much about this law that seems to make sense from a gut instinct perspective, but as soon as you think about how it would work in practice, I think it's really problematic. And I still get questions from journalists who say, well, why doesn't WhatsApp just add labels to content? And I'm like, because WhatsApp is encrypted. And I think, again, we have too many journalists, too many regulators who don't actually spend time on these platforms and understand how they work. And that is a real problem. So coming towards the end of the talk, but to answer questions about scale and impact, which is what we need to do, we need far more innovative ways of thinking about data collection and research methods. And so this is a terrible graphic, but this is what I was working on Sunday, which is on one end of the spectrum, all of these calls to say, we need platforms to give us data. Well, yes, of course, I would love to have access to all of Facebook's data. I'm a researcher. I mean, that to me would be a gold mine. But how do I feel about the fact that there has been no consent from the users to do that? And so to be fair to Facebook, they did work on a differential privacy platform to allow researchers to do some research on 2016 data. But I still feel somewhat uncomfortable about, we want this big data, but have we really thought about some of those consent issues and that they're much more challenging than people think they are? Then there's this question of like consent given for passive data collection, which is things like kind of ad collectors. So when people download a browser extension and they are having their browsing history scraped and pulled into to see what kind of Facebook ads they saw. Again, there are ways for us to do that, but there are still consent issues there about, do people really understand what they're giving away? Then there's things like active collection by users. And I do think that we have underutilized trying to bring users into these research questions and to get them to do things like collecting screenshots and sending them in. How can we think about data collection where the user is very much aware of what they're doing and becomes part of the process? But at the other end of the scale, the thing I really, really wish we could do more of is asking users to collect information they're seeing, but then asking them to reflect on that information. How do they feel about that information? How do they feel if it's been labeled? Do they think it should stay up, be taken down? How much of this are they seeing in closed messaging spaces? I just think there's so much more that we could be doing. And so very quickly, the first one on the other end of the spectrum, social science one that Facebook worked with a number of academics on, was meant to be this amazing answer to data collection. It failed after about a year and a half. It got tied up with legal responses. But what it did was that it slowed down the process of doing research. And that's what makes me so sad, is that it's 2020, nearly 2021, and we still don't have good data about the scale and impact of the problem. And I'm frustrated that Social Science 1 kind of took over too many of these conversations. And this is actually a statement by some of the academics. A lot of the funders pulled their money out. There was a lot of bad feeling after Social Science 1. We have to learn from that and say there needs to be another way that we can do this research. The second type, remember I talked about political ad collectors. This worked again in the US election. NYU has got a great ad observatory. This is a good thing. However, how do we ensure that we're working with users and they understand how their data is being used, and how can we bring them into the process as opposed to just passively collecting the data that they're getting on their different platforms? The next thing, this is from our Comprova report, but things like WhatsApp tip lines. Like, how can we find a way for users to recognize that they need to be part of this process and to send content? That is a really good thing. But again, even with Comprova, it was very one way. People would send us things, they'd get an automated thank you. We would try and write up reports, but we sometimes had 12 journalists just trying to cope with the amount of WhatsApp messages coming in. It wasn't really working with the audience. It was like, thanks, keep it coming. But it didn't feel, to me, it didn't feel like we were working in partnership with the audience, which is what we should be doing. This is some research I did last year where we worked with people in 14 countries and asked them to search for the word vaccines and to send us the results. And what was amazing was how many people said, wow, I hadn't even thought about the information that I'm seeing. I compared it with my husband. I see completely different results. This is really troubling. And it made me really passionate about thinking about these different ways that we can do research with people so that they can be part of the process. And finally, we're currently working with a partnership on AI on doing research with people on the kind of labels that they're seeing on Facebook and Instagram. And it's a diary study, so the numbers are small. But when people have finished the diary study, they talk with such passion about the process of having to reflect on what they had been collecting. And to me, that has to be the direction that we go, is partnering with people about these questions, because questions around privacy, questions about hate speech, disinformation, the content they're seeing on their feeds, we need people to be part of these conversations. I'm from Europe, and in Europe, we have a much lower tolerance of hate speech, partly because of what happened in World War II, but we are much less tolerant of hate speech. I now live in the US. Americans are much more tolerant of speech that I do not tolerate. So we also have to recognize how much of this is culturally specific. Where does Brazil sit on the spectrum of the types of speech that they want to see? And those are the kind of conversations that I would like to see governments facilitate. Let's create space to have those kind of conversations and bring the public into these conversations, because at the moment they're absent. So we need to work quickly to educate legislators and practitioners about the complexity of the information ecosystem. And we need to partner with users and communities to build resilience. So ultimately, Brazil is focused on WhatsApp because your use of WhatsApp is unlike any other country other than maybe India. And it was incredible to work in Brazil for me to see how dominant WhatsApp was. But I find it really, really problematic that there is this conversation about ending encryption in terms of being able to make messages traceable, to ensure that people have to give their ID before they get numbers. It feels really problematic to me, but I can see why people are moving in that direction, because they're so nervous about the impact of disinformation. But that's why we have to work with the community to build resilience and to partner with communities, as opposed to believing that there is a technical solution to this. Because whatever we do technically, communities and people will go elsewhere. because that's how humans operate. So my frustration is when we only see technical solutions is that we don't understand the ways in which humans will always find spaces to share this kind of information. And that's how we need to understand the space. And that's why we need to work directly with communities. So finally, first, we need to recognize the necessity for closed messaging spaces. I opened this talk by mentioning the pivot to privacy. People have moved to these spaces because they understood that they were being monitored and surveyed. They understood that the police, insurance companies, governments, researchers, journalists were spending a lot of money on social listening dashboards so that they could monitor conversations. People moved to these spaces because they understood that. And I would argue it is critical for societies that they have these spaces to have these conversations, and that by simply saying we can't have these spaces will not end people being innovative in terms of creating these spaces. Secondly, we need to recognize that speech will always find spaces to inhabit. So right now in the US, there are many people moving from Twitter and Facebook onto Parler. This is the latest, this is the newest platform. There are all sorts of other platforms like BitChute, that's like a YouTube equivalent. We can't keep playing whack-a-mole and assuming that that's going to just end so-called problematic speech. People will find other spaces. 3, as I said, we need to focus on the narratives, not just the atoms of content. And when we think about that, it will also change the ways we think about the platforms, how they work, and how people receive information on them. And we need to focus on the tactics and techniques. So Camille Francois talks about the actors, behaviors, and content of disinformation. And too often we focus on the content. Should this content be taken down? Should this content be banned? But how do we understand actors and behaviors? And how do we talk to audiences about that? Because there is some great work on this idea of inoculation, which is by actually teaching people the tactics and techniques, they are more likely to be able to identify misinformation when they see it. And so this is from research by John Cook, who he said, I found that explaining the misinformation technique completely neutralized the misinformation's influence without even mentioning the misinformation specifically. And he ends the paragraph by saying, whether you're conservative or liberal, no one wants to be deceived by misleading techniques. So if we're building resilience in these communities, we need to help people understand all the different ways that they might be manipulated, and that works across the political spectrum. So again, how can we focus on actors and behaviors, tactics and techniques, and not just focus on the content? And I'm going to play a very short video. This is from about 3 weeks ago, and this is Joe Rogan, who has the #1 podcast in the US, and he's interviewing Alex Jones, who is a known conspiracy theorist. But what I want you to understand and see in this video is they're talking about the polio vaccine in Africa. And Alex Jones says, bring this up on Google, search for this. And they start searching on Google and they try to find their own evidence. And this is what we need to understand, is that the audience is networked and they are always going to make sense of information in their own way. And when regulators think about information ecosystems in a top-down, broadcast way, they are missing this understanding of how communities are making sense of information by themselves, reshaping, resharing content amongst themselves, trying to make sense of the world. And that, I think, is missing again in the conversations. Oh, sorry. Oh, so let me just pull up the bit where, so here, Alex Jones is basically pulling up an AP article that talks about the vaccine and says, look, here's the evidence from the Associated Press. And to be fair to the Associated Press, the article is very fair. It's the headline that's problematic, but it's being weaponized by these two people who are using it to make the point. So in this context here, this is what we need to understand, that people are making sense of information in their own right. We cannot think about this in a broadcast way. And unfortunately, those people who think about quality information still think about this in a broadcast linear way, a top-down way. We need to understand this from a networked community way. And in fact, when I was in Brazil in 2018, and we were talking about Comprova, and I said, oh, so there's all these WhatsApp groups. How are we going to ensure that we're pushing out quality information into different WhatsApp groups? And a journalist turned to me and said, well, we can't create those WhatsApp groups, Claire, because that's activism. And the journalist was right. That's not how journalism works. Journalism works in a broadcast way. So how do we do the kind of quality information work that we want to do in a networked environment? Oh. And finally, we need to put the community at the center of any intervention. I was just on a call with somebody who was talking about the anti-vax movement in the US and said, we need big advertising on the side of buses. We need all of those sorts of things. I said, yes, but we also need to train up community leaders, and we need to think about this networked model if we're really going to get people to think about taking the COVID-19 vaccine. So the absence of the community really, I think, is problematic when we think about many of these conversations. And I'm not showing you this to say, oh, watch my TED Talk. But this is from last April, and I really tried to make the point that there's so many wonderful interventions and people working on disinformation globally, but in almost none of those conversations do we have representatives from the public. They're just absent. And I actually think if we're going to think about these solutions, it's about building partnerships with communities and users and the public to decide what kind of information ecosystem do we want and how can they be part of rebuilding our communication ecosystem, as opposed to a very paternalistic regulatory perspective, which I think is just doomed for failure. And so that's kind of my call to action. And so platforms have created a slew of unintended consequences globally by moving too fast. But I leave you with this: governments and those who work in the quality information space are making similar mistakes by failing to understand the ways in which freedom of expression is being threatened in ways that will be impossible to repair. And so whilst I understand this desire to do something, I worry that we are moving in directions that historians will look back at and say, they really didn't recognize what they were doing and the harm that they were creating. So I'm going to take off my slides so we can have a conversation if anybody has any questions.
Muito obrigada, Claire. Excelente. Acho que você traz uma série de questões novas para a gente pensar nesse cenário. E fiquei muito feliz de te ouvir trazer, no início da sua apresentação, a preocupação que é necessária da gente ter com o ecossistema da desinformação, principalmente num contexto em que a gente vê crescendo tanto, não só no Brasil, mas em vários países do mundo, na Europa, nos Estados Unidos também, iniciativas de se tentar acabar, por exemplo, com serviços de mensageria privada baseados em criptografia, supostamente para se enfrentar essas campanhas de desinformação. Então, fiquei muito feliz de te ouvir trazer, como uma especialista do tema, o quanto que não adianta você atacar o problema com base numa tecnologia específica, entendendo que a criptografia é fundamental para a garantia das comunicações privadas e para a garantia da credibilidade desses serviços, né? E que as campanhas de desinformação e que as práticas de desinformação certamente encontrariam outro caminho para circular no ambiente digital, e daí a importância da gente enfrentar esse debate olhando para esse ecossistema como um todo e também para as mudanças culturais que precisam ser feitas, né, para o enfrentamento cultural que precisa ser feito junto à população. Então, te agradeço muito por isso. A gente recebeu muitas perguntas, eu vou fazer aqui elas em 2 blocos, te peço, se você puder ir tomando nota das questões, para a gente poder fazê-las em bloco aqui, e vou abusar do meu papel de moderadora, aqui no início também, para eu fazer uma primeira pergunta. Acho que foi muito interessante esse gráfico que você falou que você começou a trabalhar no domingo sobre acesso a dados para efeitos de pesquisa para o enfrentamento à desinformação, Mas eu queria te ouvir também sobre como você acha que a gente pode enfrentar o uso de dados pessoais que é feito pelas plataformas para o direcionamento de conteúdo, nesse contexto de combate à desinformação. Ou seja, voltando ao exemplo que todo mundo conhece da Cambridge Analytica, como que é possível a gente limitar, de alguma maneira, o uso de dados pessoais, principalmente de dados sensíveis, como opinião política, orientação sexual, raça, né, religião, e que são muito efetivos quando você direciona conteúdo para gerar dano e para gerar desinformação. Então, eu queria te fazer essa primeira pergunta e te trazer duas primeiras aqui do nosso público. Elas são bem próximas. E a gente está com tempo bastante aqui para fazer as perguntas, então podemos responder com calma. Uma delas diz o seguinte: como você mencionou, não temos a definição exata para o que estamos enfrentando hoje. Quais elementos você considera que precisamos levar em conta para acertar o combate à desinformação? E a outra pergunta, que é bastante próxima dessa, como pesquisadora, existe um parâmetro que você considera adequado, que o Brasil deveria prestar atenção para basear suas iniciativas de combate à desinformação? A gente começa com essas e depois a gente faz um outro bloco. Obrigada.
I think so. I will ask more clarifying questions if I need them. So, of course, the question of micro-targeting and disinformation is really, really problematic. I have been shocked that the revelations about Cambridge Analytica didn't have more impact. There was a couple of weeks where people said boycott Facebook, but really the network effects of Facebook mean that too many people see the benefits of it. But I would argue the only way that we can increase people's knowledge is by doing more auditing of exactly what you said, Bia, which is what kind of advertising is being targeted based on gender, religion, age, race, ethnicity. I don't think enough people still understand how these algorithms work. Still too many people who are smart say, well, I see everything on Facebook. I see everything my friends post. And you're like, no, you don't. You see the stuff that you're more likely to click on. And when you say, well, why did you see that ad? Most people will say, well, because Facebook is listening to me. I mean, people seem to have this idea that Facebook is listening to you, but they have very little understanding of how their credit card data is being matched with their geolocation data, is being matched with their Facebook usage. So I would still say that we need wide scale, basically digital literacy training, not just how do you read a headline, how do these platforms work? How do they make money? It is crazy to me that there are still people who don't understand how that works. So many of you probably have heard of the Markup, which is a website run by Julia Angwin in the US. And they do incredible investigations where they basically audit the algorithms, they audit advertising campaigns and show why certain things are being distributed to certain people. I mean, I would also argue in the US, you probably know that political advertising was banned for a week before the election, then they've extended it. I mean, as researchers, we have to work with Facebook to say, well, what did that do? Did that really help? Did it actually hurt people lower down the ballot, smaller candidates who couldn't advertise? So unfortunately, again, this is such a complex problem. And from a research perspective, it's very hard for us to know how much of this data is micro-targeted, how much disinformation is micro-targeted, how much of it is getting through, what was the difference in 2020 to 2016? And unfortunately, without that data, we're flying blind, because there are many people who say, well, I feel all right about targeted advertising because I get stuff that's more relevant to me. Until there is an outcry of people saying, no, I do not want to be targeted because I'm a woman over the age of 40, or no, I do not want to be targeted because I'm a Black man in Detroit, or, you know, or I live in Sao Paulo. So we just have really low levels of literacy, and that's part of the problem. So we need more investigations, and we need to put more pressure on the platforms. I took notes, but I've said atom. Can you remind me of the second question?
Imagina, a segunda é se existe um parâmetro que você considera adequado para basear as iniciativas do Brasil no combate à desinformação. Acho que quando a pessoa está perguntando sobre parâmetro, é no sentido de entender caminhos adequados para o enfrentamento à desinformação, considerando aí que a gente está tratando de um fenômeno em que ainda há uma discussão sobre a própria definição dele no contexto regulatório.
I mean, I would say because Brazil is so far in front because of your use of WhatsApp. I mean, I say to Americans all the time, Americans will be like, what do we have to learn from the rest of the world? I love Americans, but they tend to think that they're the center of the universe. And I say, go and spend time in Brazil, go and spend time in India, and you will understand how SMSs and WhatsApp messages will start to impact America. And we've seen this in 2020, it has happened. So I would say I would love to see Brazil being really innovative in terms of research that you could do to understand how disinformation is impacting different communities. How can you do research where you're actually collecting with communities and making them think through where they're getting their information? I mean, Brazil, like the US, is very polarized, and we can't disentangle disinformation from polarization, because when you've got information ecosystems where half the population watches one type of media and half the population watches another, and there's no shared ground other than WhatsApp groups, that is a problem. And you have families torn apart. I mean, there are many issues in Brazil that are very similar to the US. So I would argue that if Brazil can take the lead in really understanding what it means to have a networked audience where WhatsApp peer-to-peer communication is so critical, I would argue that you are at the absolute forefront of this. And I worry that some of the regulation in Brazil is not recognizing that in many ways you have this amazing opportunity to understand user behavior that I would argue is the most advanced in the world. The US will look like Brazil in 5 years' time. And so that's what I would like to see Brazil do. I know it's hard because there is such a fear around disinformation that people want to take action. But I think the biggest opportunity is research and partnering with communities who rely so much on this technology.
Obrigada, Claire. Vou fazer um segundo bloco de perguntas aqui, que tem a ver um pouco com o papel das plataformas no enfrentamento à desinformação. Uma delas, que veio da nossa audiência, diz o seguinte: considerando que muitas notícias falsas são veiculadas pelos serviços privados de mensageria e pelas redes sociais, como você vê o papel e a responsabilidade dessas grandes empresas? Lembrando, por exemplo, que a gente tem no Brasil o Marco Civil da Internet, que diz no seu artigo 19 que a responsabilidade por conteúdos gerados por terceiros é de quem gerou esses conteúdos e só seria responsabilidade, só haveria uma corresponsabilidade dessas plataformas a partir do momento que elas recebessem uma ordem judicial para a remoção desse conteúdo e não os removessem, né? Então, tem todo um debate em torno do enfrentamento à desinformação no Brasil e se o Marco Civil seria ou não um impedimento para esse enfrentamento. Uma segunda pergunta também fala, você citou, por exemplo, na sua apresentação, tanto a rotulação de conteúdos pelas plataformas, como a derrubada de alguns conteúdos com base nos termos de uso dessas plataformas. E aí a gente recebeu uma pergunta que diz: colocar as big techs para verificar fatos não gera um risco, não vai necessariamente gerar um risco de parcialidade na verificação desses fatos? Lembrando que nem todas as plataformas trabalham com organizações de verificação de fatos independentes para fazer essa checagem. Então, deixar esse bloco primeiro sobre, esse segundo bloco de perguntas com o papel das plataformas, para te ouvir sobre isso.
Yeah, so the first question really gets to this law in the US, which is Section 230, which is the same idea in Brazil, which is that ultimately the platforms are not liable for content on their platforms. I would argue that they have hidden behind Section 230 for too long, and they've said, oh, we're just a pipeline, it's not our fault. At the same time, I don't want to change it to say that the platforms are responsible for everything, because if we do that, we will go back to a chilling effect on speech, and the platforms will shut down lots of speech. The problem we have is people say, are they platforms or publishers? They are a hybrid. They are a new form of communication medium, and we need regulation that responds to this new type of communication medium. The thing about Section 230 is that the platforms are commercial entities, but they should be held accountable to say they are our public square now. And for that reason, they need to work with researchers, civil society, and the public to figure out the kind of conversations we want in the public square. And these commercial entities should spend a lot of money on paying content moderators to ensure that our public square is clean, and that there's nobody standing on a chair swearing, that there's nobody being xenophobic. And so, so when people go, well, they're commercial companies, it's not their responsibility. Well, they've made it their responsibility by becoming our most important communication device. And so I would argue for governments, rather than saying, well, stop these liability laws, make them liable for everything. Well, liability in that context means that they're just going to squash speech. We have to have an environment where we say, what kind of speech do we want and how do we make that happen? And that it does connect with that second question about labeling and fact checkers. So Twitter currently is doing their own fact checking. They are not outsourcing it. And Facebook does outsource it to the third-party fact checking initiative, which has a code of practice. They have audits about whether or not fact checkers still apply to that. But from our research that we've done, particularly people on the right hate the fact checkers, hate the labels, and really it's driving down trust in Facebook more generally. So there's an interesting comparison here around, should platforms be doing it themselves or Facebook? I really worry about Silicon Valley companies making decisions about speech, particularly about Brazil. I mean, that would be crazy. They can't even do it in the US very well. So the challenge we have is, how do we bring the community into these conversations? How do we find a way to say, we're not downranking this because a fact checker has said it. We're downranking it because enough people have provided evidence, and here's the evidence that you can see that suggests that this piece of content might lead to harm. Like, we're not going to get to this point quickly, but we need to be much more nuanced about how do we develop a way of saying this particular post might lead to X or Y, and who are the people who make those decisions. And I think Twitter moved very quickly because it was the US election, but I think there's going to be a lot of reflections on, can they scale that? I mean, today I just tweeted a thread from one of my team in India who said, here's everything that was labeled in the US. Here's my Indian tweets from Indian politicians who weren't labeled at all. Like, how can Twitter scale? They can't scale. So these platforms are going to need more innovative ways of labeling, demoting, downranking, all of these things they're doing. They need to find partnerships with a whole range of organizations, not just fact checkers.
Obrigada, Claire. Acho que isso dialoga bastante com uma pergunta que a gente recebeu aqui, e que acho que você também falou no final da sua apresentação, que é se você considera a população uma peça-chave nessa equação. Acho que foi o final da sua apresentação, a pergunta chegou antes, né? E o comentário que a gente recebeu foi que parece uma luta muito desigual, porque a população é usuária desses serviços privados e, ao mesmo tempo, é alvo da indústria da desinformação. Então, a grande questão é como a gente preserva essa liberdade de expressão, fazendo enfrentamento à desinformação ao mesmo tempo. E acho que você já trouxe isso um pouco nessa sua última reflexão. Eu queria te perguntar, a gente recebeu uma pergunta também sobre a possibilidade de se acionar mais o Poder Judiciário para fazer o enfrentamento à desinformação. A gente teve uma pergunta se um caminho seria lidar com essa desinformação mal intencionada, né, que tem a intenção de causar dano, da mesma maneira como lidamos com elas no ambiente offline, no mundo real. né, por via judicial. Então, tem uma pergunta sobre o papel da justiça e do poder judiciário em relação a essa questão. Queria te fazer uma outra pergunta, a gente recebeu uma pergunta também, se você acha que a regulação é a solução. Eu acho que você apontou em vários momentos que antes da gente tentar regular é preciso pesquisar e ter um debate mais amplo que envolva o conjunto da sociedade, mas tem uma pergunta específica para te ouvir, se você acha que a regulação é uma solução para esse diálogo entre grandes empresas, veículos de comunicação e sociedade. E uma última pergunta, que é uma questão que sempre domina aí, sempre perpassa pelos debates sobre a internet, que é a questão da jurisdição. Considerando que as grandes empresas, né, que as big techs, estão baseadas e reguladas, ou na Europa, ou nos Estados Unidos, mas têm alcance no mundo todo, e, ao mesmo tempo, a desinformação é produzida no Brasil e usa essas plataformas, ou seja, a gente tem indivíduos nacionais utilizando serviços internacionais. Esse é mais um desafio na sua avaliação para o enfrentamento à desinformação. O que a gente pode fazer? E aí, já dando o meu testemunho aqui, sobre essa discussão do projeto brasileiro de enfrentamento à desinformação, uma parte significativa da dificuldade que a gente tem na interlocução com as plataformas é que algumas medidas que nos parecem ser efetivas para enfrentar a desinformação aqui e que poderiam ser incorporadas no projeto de lei, muitas vezes, quando a gente propõe isso para as plataformas, a resposta é, mas a mudança de um produto global demora 5 anos para acontecer, a gente não vai conseguir fazer isso, ou isso gera um custo enorme para as plataformas. Então, a gente queria te ouvir também sobre isso, e com isso a gente encerra as perguntas.
Yeah, so this question of law, I think this goes back to those 4 motivations that I talked about. I mean, I think if people are using the internet to make money through hoaxes and by scams, then to me, that is something that we should legislate against. We should, that should be somebody's broken a law if they're trying to use like imposter content using somebody's logo. I mean, we have laws around copyright and other things. I'm just going to say, it makes me feel uncomfortable to think about bringing the judiciary into this, partly because I worry about that judiciaries in not all countries are independent. And so I think it's hard to give one answer about this. And for example, in South Africa, they have regulation where people who share misinformation are fined and sometimes put in prison. That makes me very nervous because of that question of, did they know it was false? Did they mean to cause harm? Like, it's very difficult to do that. But I would argue that there are examples of disinformation where we have evidence that people are coordinating to make money or to damage somebody's reputation or to interfere in an election, that we could argue that there should be a legal framework for that. It just, again, like everything, needs to be thought through very carefully about the unintended consequences of people sharing it. I feel very uncomfortable with those people being prosecuted. Maybe if there's enough evidence that somebody has knowingly created content to cause harm. But again, we need to work on that. The question about regulation alone, of course, my answer is no. I'm very much in support of a whole of society response. We need more from platforms, more from governments, more from educators, more from civil society, more from academia, and we need to bring the public into all of this. The problem is people want a quick solution. So I've been at conferences for 4 years where we talk about media literacy and people are like, oh, no, that's going to take too long. We just need to get Facebook to change its algorithm. And the truth is, this is too complex to have any one solution. It unfortunately is something that's going to take 30 to 50 years. It's going to take a whole of society response, and it's made more complex because of this last question about jurisdiction. Brazil should have a right to think about these challenges in a completely different way to the UK, and in a completely different way to the US, and in a completely different way to Nigeria, and a completely different way to India. The platforms want one scalable solution because they want everything to be automated. They want everything to be scalable. They want everything to be as simple as possible so they can make the most money. The thing is, the way that Brazil thinks about speech is very different to the way that the UK thinks about speech, in a subtle cultural way. And that is how we should be responding to this, which is the people of Brazil should be having conversations about the type of speech that they want to see. And the people in the UK should have a similar conversation. But the platforms do not want this at all, for understandable reasons. But we have to put pressure on them. But to this last question about jurisdiction, yesterday, Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg gave evidence again to a Senate committee. They gave evidence 2 weeks ago. They gave evidence 2 weeks before that. Have they given evidence to a Brazilian court? They haven't given evidence to the UK Parliament. They haven't given evidence to the Canadian Parliament. I mean, it is insane that the CEOs of these companies cannot be held accountable by the governments of individual companies whose users spend so much time on that. And I mean, you know this in Brazil, but the amount of people who work for Facebook who are Brazilian is very, very small. I don't know yet whether you have a WhatsApp representative, but for a long time, there was nobody working at WhatsApp from Brazil. They had one person from India, but it was astonishing. And so when we talk about jurisdictions, if there were more people from these countries reporting back to Silicon Valley, we would not have as many of these problems. And I will say this, the platforms are causing real harm in the US, and they are US companies speaking the same language. The harm these platforms are doing in Brazil, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Indonesia, it's just extraordinary. And there's really no way to provide that cultural and linguistic context to the platforms, and countries are hurting very seriously because of it. So this jurisdiction question is the biggest one, but how you would put pressure on Facebook to say you need to hire another 3,000 people in Brazil alone, they're not going to do it. And so that's unfortunately the biggest problem that we face.
Obrigada, Claire. Você traz mais um elemento fundamental que para mim, enquanto representante aí do terceiro setor no Comitê Gestor da Internet, a importância da mobilização da sociedade civil nessa pressão por mais transparência das plataformas e por respostas mais ativas. Eu tive a oportunidade de participar recentemente de uma pesquisa que o Intervozes, que é a organização em que eu atuo, fez justamente sobre os mecanismos adotados pelas plataformas para combater a desinformação aqui no Brasil. E a gente vê o quanto que essas ações são pontuais, são reativas, são desorganizadas e não são estruturadas enquanto parte das políticas das próprias plataformas. Isso dificulta, inclusive, você medir a eficácia, se essas medidas de fato estão trazendo resultados para o enfrentamento à desinformação, e dificulta, inclusive, o usuário saber o que ele pode fazer dentro da plataforma ou não. E acho que você traz elementos importantes para esse debate. Eu queria te agradecer muito, passar para as suas considerações finais, agradecendo mais uma vez a rica contribuição que você trouxe para esse debate.
Well, thank you, Bia. I mean, I won't be very long, but just to say that time is passing and we keep having the same conversations. And so we have to, as researchers, as members of civil society, find ways to hold platforms accountable. And the way we do that is by doing research with users and making users understand how they are being manipulated. And so when we do research, it shouldn't be passively collecting data from users. We need to research with them so that they look at their phones and say, hang on, why am I seeing this? And somebody's seeing that. They need to be part of these conversations, partly because they need to help shape the kind of platform spaces we have, but also it's about putting pressure on the platforms. At the moment, nothing seems to be harming them. Their profits are still going up, yet the disinformation is traveling on their platform. So we need more platform accountability, but in the process of working with the public, my hope is that they become much more aware of the ways in which disinformation is harming their communities, and they become critical parts of our solution, which is that they have conversations with each other about the ways in which disinformation is affecting their communities. And I think at the moment there's this idea of like, oh, whatever, it's social media, it's WhatsApp, it doesn't matter. Well, we're seeing in countries like Brazil and the US, the growth of polarization, the widening of political perspectives, the growth of the alt-right, the growth of white supremacy. These are not small things that we're seeing. It's not just disinformation about whether or not you can drink bleach if you've got COVID. We're seeing a lot of messages that are leading to harm and friction and tension in societies around the world. And so we need to bring the public into this so that they can recognize the harm that's happening. And maybe we have to talk about a historical lens to say, how will historians judge us and the ways in which information is harming us? And to the person who asked the question, yes, it's deeply frustrating that we are going to have to be the solution here. It's deeply frustrating that we're saying it's up to the users to be more responsible, but we don't have any other option. We need to recognize that we're the ones that are being weaponized. If we didn't share this, we wouldn't have a problem. And unfortunately, the best messengers to get that across is one-to-one, is us talking to our friends and families and neighbors and communities. It's not a big splashy campaign on the side of a bus. So I think there is no shortcut for us getting out of this mess. It's going to take years. It's going to take a lot of conversations. It's going to take a lot of research. It's going to take a lot of patience. But we have to recognize that's the seriousness of the problem. And if we don't, we're going to keep having these conference presentations every 2 years and be like, still a problem. Yes, it is a problem, but we want to believe that we're moving in a positive direction. So I'm still hopeful, even though I do this work every day. But my call is that we root all of this work in the community, and then I really believe that we will start to see really positive developments. So thank you very much for inviting me. I really loved the conversation.
Nós aqui agradecemos mais uma vez o seu trabalho, o seu engajamento pessoal, Claire, e também da First Draft News, que segue sendo uma referência para a gente aqui no Brasil de boas práticas nesse enfrentamento à desinformação e de pesquisa também. Acho que você traz esse alerta e a gente tem uma comunidade acadêmica muito ativa aqui no Brasil, pesquisando e levantando dados e enfrentando, inclusive, a opacidade, muitas vezes, das plataformas para ter acesso a esses dados para ter resultados nos seus estudos em relação ao enfrentamento à desinformação e às campanhas de desinformação que circulam nas redes. E acho que você traz ótimos inputs aí para o trabalho dessa comunidade acadêmica seguir bastante ativa também aqui no Brasil. Acho que a gente vive um momento importante de instauração da Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados no nosso país, e uma parte significativa do trabalho da autoridade é justamente produzir estudos, produzir pesquisa, ouvir o cidadão e fomentar essa cultura da privacidade. E não à toa, a gente trouxe esse tema para o Seminário de Privacidade aqui do Comitê Gestor da Internet, porque essas questões estão diretamente relacionadas, né? O uso que é feito dos nossos dados, ele potencializa o resultado das práticas e das campanhas de desinformação, e a Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados começando a funcionar, a gente espera que também seja um caminho para fazer um enfrentamento à desinformação. Fazer mais um convite para todo mundo que está nos assistindo, seguir acompanhando o seminário. A gente vai até a sexta-feira com vários painéis. Hoje, daqui 15 minutos, começa a próxima mesa. E para quem quiser mergulhar um pouco mais fundo na discussão sobre o PL 2630, que é o chamado PL das fake news aqui no Brasil, a gente vai ter uma mesa hoje às 5h30 da tarde. Agradecer muito, Claire, em nome do Comitê Gestor da Internet e do NIC.br, que são os organizadores desse evento. Agradecer a equipe de tradução, que permitiu a gente fazer essa conversa com você, a Isadora, que está aqui nos bastidores contribuindo, e todo mundo da equipe do Comitê Gestor da Internet também. Obrigada. Tchau.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Encerrada a transmissão.
Wonderful, amazing. Thank you very much. I think I speak for B as well. We have a lot of work to do. It was amazing. We almost reached 500 people online.
Wow.
Yes, the chat was very heated, but I'm sure we got through our message. Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Bia.
It was my pleasure. And thank you very much to the translators. It was amazing as ever. Yeah, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
be in touch.
All right. Take care.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you, Claire. Bye. Tchau,
Bia,
Isa. Vocês precisam de mim
fantástico.
para mais alguma coisa?
Pode ir, a gente entra em contato depois. Muito obrigada, foi ótimo.
Agradeço, obrigada às meninas da tradução, suaram aí, né?
Ela fala rápido.
E eu também.
E você também, mas eu tenho certeza que deu tudo certo.
No começo, eu saí assim, né, e eu falo muito rápido, e no meio eu falei, nossa, as meninas estão traduzindo, para tudo, aí eu tentei desacelerar no começo, assim, mas aí ela foi embora, mas eu ouvi a tradução aqui, foi excelente, obrigada, viu, gente, valeu demais.
Maravilha, Bia, a gente se vê.
Boa
Tchau,
continuação do seminário, valeu, beijo.
Valeu. Pessoal do próximo painel, painel 3, sejam muito bem-vindos. Quem tem aí, Elba, minha conterrânea, tudo bem?
Olá,
Thiago,
olá. Você é Isadora. Olá, Isadora.
Sou
tudo
eu.
bom?
Tudo ótimo.
Eu sei que você é baiana?
Dos e-mails. Sou baiana.
Ah, que legal. Moro em São Paulo.
Moro em São Paulo. Saí de Salvador do nosso calor para estar aqui na chuva, mas com muito prazer.
Olá, Cris.
Oi, Isadora.